Tiger Bay, Tiger Bay, Tiger Bay, Tiger Bay, oh, Tiger Bay.
Well, croeso cynnes iawn I Bai Caerdydd. That's a warm welcome to Cardiff Bay. We have just come out of the Cardiff Bay Visitor Centre. The purpose of our journey this morning is to see what was going on in Cardiff Bay before Cardiff Bay came into the picture in 1987. In fact, what I'm going to do is take you back into the previous century, long before any of you can remember, right to 1811, because at that time, Cardiff was merely a village around Cardiff Castle, just 1 mile from the seafront, in an area known as St John's Parish. Now, south of St John's was St Mary's Parish, and that's the very land we're standing on at this moment. But in those days, all this land was waterlogged, marshland, or tidal in some way, right up to the little village. Now, at the same time, in the Rhondda Valley, iron and then subsequently coal was being excavated and making its way down to the village of Cardiff along the Glamorganshire Canal. All we had were a few little quays along the banks of the River Taff, which flowed down Westcott Street at that time and was located near to Cardiff Castle. But by that early part of the century, these quays were no longer large enough to export the amount of tonnage that was coming down from the valleys. And it just so happened that the Marquis of Butte, John Crichton Stuart, the second Marquis of Butte and 7th Earl of Dumfries, owned all of this land known as St Mary's Parish. And he decided he would reclaim this land from the sea and build Cardiff docks. It was a tremendous effort because the Marquis was unable to get the labour force to actually dig out the dock because of Chartist rebellions and social upheavals that were taking place across the country. And in order to get his dock built, he went to Ireland and imported 200 Irishmen into South Wales who actually dug out the first of the Butte docks in 1836. And from that point on began the transformation of Cardiff from the village into the city we recognise today. And with that as a preface, I guess we can start our walk along the seafront and I'll tell you the rest of the history of how the village grew into the city. Yes, now we've just passed the Norwegian church, but of course that is a new location. It hasn't always been on the seafront, and it was actually built in 1868, and I'll tell you more about it later when we see the area where the Norwegian church originally stood. But as I was saying to you, the Marquis built the first dock in 1836. But dock building would actually go on until 1907, not so many years ago, over there at the Alexandra dock where you can see the blue cranes towering into the skyline there. The Marquis became so wealthy that he decided to rebuild Cardiff Castle. Once he moved into it, it set a trend for all the wealthy people living on the seafront to begin to follow the Marquis into the new suburbs. And as the wealthy people moved into those new areas, seamen from the 4 quarters of the world began to settle in what became known as the docks and a half-mile up Butte Street, Tiger Bay, where you could literally see the world in 1 square mile as more than 50 different nationalities of people came and lived together, I might say harmoniously together, in this one area on the seafront. Now also, if you can see, obviously, the very distinctive pierhead building in red terracotta stone there with its clock tower. And if we look over here, we can see a willow tree. And both these have been landmarks to seamen throughout the century, like my grandfather and father who sailed around the pierhead of the Penarth Peninsula there. Once the seamen from the area could see these landmarks, they knew they were safely home as they sailed into Cardiff docks. Now if you look across the bay, you can see a red brick building with a square tower. That used to be the pump house, which used to open up 3 lock gates which allowed ships to sail into the Mount Stuart dry dock to get their engines repaired. Now the actual repair shed is now National Techniquest, the largest hands-on interactive science museum in all of Europe, which actually attracts more than 250,000 visitors each year into the Cardiff Bay area. Next to it is Landsea House, which was the actual headquarters for the dry dock, and of course today it's been transformed into Harry Ramsden's, the largest and most glamorous of all his restaurants in the world. And right in front of us we can see wooden derricks or pontoons which used to have platforms which allowed pleasure seekers to go down onto paddle steamers like the Waverley, the Cardiff Queen and the Glen Usk, and they could sail across the estuary to Weston-super-Mare and other exotic locations on the English coastline like Ilfracombe and Minehead. Victorian pleasure seekers came down here when they got off the tram cars. The local boys used to run over, carry your bag, Mr. or Mrs. or Madam perhaps, and they'd make a penny taking their bags over to the queue shed. Now you can't fail to notice the Roman numeral water level markers. Notice them on the side of the entrance to the East Butte dock there. Those markers reassured sea captains it was safe to sail their ships up into the big docks. And remember, in 1913 Cardiff docks exported 14 million tons of coal in 1 year, and huge ships queued 2 and 3 days at a time to get in and out of our docks. Now, as I've already told you, this was a major seaport, and in the local community, the seamen here exported all this Welsh coal to the rest of the world. The seamen from our community, through World War I and World War II, took their lives into their hands by taking ships out onto the sea. Many of our grandfathers and fathers lost their lives out at sea, and we've often wondered why there isn't a memorial to represent the courage of these men. And now this year, we finally have a memorial, as you can see right here on the seafront. This is meant, of course, to be the hulk of a ship, but as we can see from this side, here is the face of a universal seaman in repose with his face down to the seabed. Here we are standing in front of the Pierhead building, a magnificent structure designed by William Frame 100 years ago. This is the building that houses Associated British Ports, who are the company which runs what remains of Cardiff docks. It's a magnificent structure covered in all kinds of ornamentation, from gargoyles to symbols, industrial symbols, bestial creatures like lions, and it has a motto, Earth ddŵr a thân, which is by fire and water. And Associated British Ports, as I say, still runs Cardiff docks, but not the Cardiff docks of the past. We only have the Roath and the Alexandra. All the other docks began to decline in the 1950s with the petrol coming into the picture and replacing coal. So fewer ships came in and out of Cardiff docks. And that is the reason our mudflat grew in front of the city, because in the heyday of shipping, all of this mudflat was dredged on a daily basis so that ships could sail into the East Butte dock and the West Butte dock on the other side of this grand building. Well, if we look over to the left, we can now see the remains of Butte Crescent. These grand Georgian and Victorian buildings once came all the way down to the pierhead at the seafront, and it was the homes of the shipping magnates and coal merchants, and they lived in these houses and they could look at the ships sailing into the Oval Basin, making their journey into the West Butte dock, the first of our docks to be built, to export our Welsh coal, and this they could witness from their very windows and their front doors. Because of the prosperity that took place in our docks, there was a need to build a merchant exchange, and it was decided to build it right on the seafront where we now see the Industrial Maritime Museum, and this meant that some of the Georgian homes had to be demolished in order to build this magnificent structure. However, in 1892 this building caught on fire, but after the fire completely destroyed this building, it was rebuilt and it became Powell Dyffryn House, built in the Dutch or Flemish gabled architectural style. Of course, Powell and Dyffryn were famous colliery owners, and this was the source of wealth in those days, and being wealthy men, they could have a building like this named after themselves. Now, shall we go across and see Butte Crescent and cross over the entrance to the Oval Basin? Come along. Now, have any of you seen the film Tiger Bay, which was made in the 1950s by J. Lee Thompson? Well, it's a film that's very much loved by people in the local community because it was made at a time before the tremendous upheaval that took place in our area. In the 1960s, Cardiff City Council decided to demolish the legacy of the Marquis of Bute, and we lost lots of Georgian, Victorian and Edwardian buildings, and the beautiful Loudon Square disappeared. But this film was made when those buildings were still standing, so when we see it today, we really get a thrill to see the community we lived in, the streets that we can no longer see. But in that particular film, there was lots of people like Haley Mills, John Mills, Horsbridge Holtz in his first English-speaking film, and of course myself, the only person in the film who spoke with a genuine Cardiff accent. There was a scene that took place actually right here, because here we are at the pierhead. This is where a ramp used to go right down to the paddle steamers. And on this ramp, Haley Mills and I had this great scene. Now, Haley Mills is an English girl, and to set her into the picture, she was sent down to Cardiff to stay with her Welsh auntie, who was played by Meg Jenkins, and they lived in Tiger Bay. And Auntie Meg sends her off to buy some sausages on an errand. So off she goes, and then when she buys the sausages, instead of going straight home like she was supposed to, she comes down the pierhead and sees me and a bunch of other kids from Tiger Bay in the docks playing around cowboys and Indians on this ramp, and she wants to join in, so she runs up to me and she says, "Can I play?" And I says, "No, you can't." She says, "I got a bomb." So she has this string with a cat bomb on it, and you just drop it, and then it goes bang. I said, "Cowboys don't play with bombs. And anyway, get back to London, Gilly Evans. You don't belong down here." So we got into a fight, and we fell down the ramp. Now, it's not the Oscar-winning performances that matter. Right behind us was Powell Dyffryn House, and you could see it in all its magnificence, and standing there with its Dutch gabled roofs. But also you could see Stuart Street, which is now a ghost of itself. All down Stuart Street were many other streets leading off from James Street, like George Street, Louisa Street, South William Street and Evelyn Street. And as each street made a corner with Stuart Street, there was a pub, a cafe, a restaurant, or a business. There was a saltfish shop on George Street itself, owned by Josefina Hormachea of the Spanish community, and she had a large family, but this was a wonderful little shop that when you stepped inside, you could see the saltfish hanging from the ceiling and smell those distinctive aromas. But you could also smell Josefina's cooking, because behind the shop was a huge kitchen and a large wooden table. And if you were in the shop and you were buying food and you decided you wanted to eat, you could actually go in the back room and sit at Josefina's table, as many an itinerant seaman had done, and bought a meal. And among those seamen, Aristotle Onassis was a regular in Josefina's kitchen. Here we are at Wales's most famous address, Butte Street. You had every community in business on Butte Street: the Jewish community, the Chinese community, Maltese, Portuguese, you name it, we had it. I think it'd be best for me to take you up to Butte Street because it's changed so much since the demolition in the 1960s that we'll go to the only part of Butte Street that the Marquis of Butte would recognise today. So let's go. Yes? This part of Butte Street obviously is much damaged by the demolitions of the 1960s and 70s. But if we look over there, we can see this amazing little portico, the front door of this building, which was once the coal board. Now this building isn't as derelict as it appears. It actually forms offices for the businesses that are located on Butte Crescent, which Butte Crescent, like so many of the buildings in the area, was zoned for commercial activities only, and these grand homes became businesses and local people had to move from these kinds of premises. Of course, it's a tragedy that buildings of this character were demolished in the 60s and 70s because, as an example, if you look at Eli Jenkins, you can see what can happen when these buildings, more than 150 years old, are refurbished and brought back to life. Of course, this is a new theme pub, and Eli Jenkins was the sea captain in Dylan Thomas's fictional village of Llagarib, which is bugger all backwards, of course. Now, we should move along and look at the Packet, one of the original pubs in the area. In the heyday of Tiger Bay and the docks, there were 93 different pubs and drinking establishments, one on every street corner. Now, we only have a handful, so things are not nearly as exciting today as it was just a few years ago. Here we are in front of the Packet. At one time or another there was a pub on every street corner in the area, and as you now know, we only have a handful, so it's not nearly as exciting today as it used to be. But not only were there legitimate pubs, there were shebeens and lots of illegal drinking places, so you could always find a place to have a drink and a dance in Tiger Bay and the docks in the not too distant past, when you couldn't get a drink on Sunday and had to go home at 10 o'clock. But that didn't abide in the community of Tiger Bay and the docks. But it's great that we still have these old buildings, because if you look above, you can see the interesting mouldings and features that made Tiger Bay a very pleasant place to grow up in. And now we'll go up to the corner of Butte Street and look at the magnificent Midland Bank building. Now, once again, we're coming to the corner of James Street and Butte Street, and we see another magnificent building. And of course, if you don't look up, you're not going to see all these interesting features carved into the masonry. Not only is there fruit and all sorts of plant life, but even mythological beasts and creatures hiding there and looking down at us. And of course, this building was built at the turn of the century, and it still remains the Midland Bank to this day. And now we'll go up Butte Street and see other buildings of an equal calibre to this building. So just come along with me now to James Street. All the out-of-work seamen used to stand at this very location, right at the entrance to the dock, hoping that a sea captain would go by, or a boatswain, in hopes that they'd get a job and the captain would say, "Right lads, we need a few mates on deck or on board," and that way they'd get a job. Now, right across from us, we see the magnificent, or was once the magnificent, post office building right at the entrance to the dock. And it's distinguished by its pillars and red brick. And as a lad, I did used to feel quite majestic going in there to buy a penny stamp. And hopefully that this building will once again come back to life. Now, everybody, let's go over to the old part of Butte Street to see some more interesting buildings. So follow me this way. Right, this is the side of Butte Street that the gentry lived on in the 1850s, because this is the only side where the homes were located. And this particular building, Butte Chambers, is a very interesting building which you must look up in order to admire. Otherwise you're going to miss these images of perhaps your friends and relatives, these grand gargoyles. This is why I said it was so interesting growing up in Tiger Bay in the docks to live in this community, because you had all of this, all these features to spur your imagination as you played around the streets. Now on the opposite side we can see one of the buildings built by the Corey brothers, and these were big time players in the shipping of coal and the docking industry. And again, this is a building you have to look up at, otherwise you'll miss these faces looking down at you, and other ornate features hidden in the architecture of this particular building. We now come to the grand National Westminster Bank building with its magnificent classical facade and other interesting features, such as this grand front door here. I'm sure you'd love to have a door like this on your house. And above the door, of course, is the statue of the goddess of equity, who is weighing a human head in her right hand. Her job is to make sure that everything comes out equal. Now, these doors are open during the week, and because the designers and architects of this building decided they wanted to make a replica or a symmetrical copy of this particular facade, we'll see another facade on the other side with a door similar to this, which both sides are open and used as a hallway or passage or street, which has been used throughout this century by local people. Even though we were a very small 1 square mile community, we had every embassy and every consulate on our doorstep, and that's one of the reasons we had to build the buildings along Butte Street at this point. Now we'll move along and see the Baltimore Arms next door, which was once the old Butte Dock Hotel. So let's travel along to that part. This was the Butte Dock Hotel, and it ran from this side of Butte Street right through the other side to West Butte Street, and is in fact the oldest licensed drinking establishment in post-village Cardiff. It was actually built in 1839. The interior has lots of murals and artwork done by local South Wales artist John Allinson, who has painted larger-than-life characters from old Tiger Bay in the docks and the streets of Tiger Bay in the docks, which are all around the walls, including images of Victor Parker, famous for his jazz guitar, Joey Erskine, a famous boxer, and other people known and unknown from the community are found inside this particular building. Once again, we can really see the buildings on the opposite side with their Dutch, Flemish and gabled architecture. And notice those chimneys up there, something that I'm sure Mary Poppins would die for. You don't see that kind of architecture too much around this area. And there's somebody looking down at us. You see the face of that man there. There's so many interesting things to see, which in a normal working day you might pass by and not even notice. Now, many of these buildings, which were built for shipping offices, like Dock Chambers, where Butte Town History and Arts is now located, and these buildings opposite us were actually owned by Greek shipping magnate families. At the far end, the magnificent Pascoe house with a great deal of ornamentation. Now, all the local cleaners, our mothers and grandmothers who cleaned these offices in the heyday, all of the local ones will tell you that that building is haunted. And perhaps it's the reason that there's so few tenants in there to this day. But they all talk about squeaking floors and lights that go on and off in that particular building. Now, if you look over to the left, you can see where the West Butte Dock used to be. It was there that the Norwegian church once stood, and it's where Roald Dahl was actually baptised, as many of the Norwegian seamen sailed into Cardiff docks to bring timber into South Wales to support the mining community by taking timber up to the valleys to prop up the mine pits. Now I come to the saddest part of this journey around Tiger Bay in the docks, because I would love to take you to the Tiger Bay that I grew up in. But sadly, all of it has been demolished and been replaced by rather lackluster council estate architecture, and there isn't anything left of Tiger Bay as I knew it for you to see.
Tiger Bay, Tiger Bay. It's not very far from the docks. When you get to Loudon Square, turn to the right and you're not far from there. Tiger Bay, Tiger Bay. It's just like a fancy dress ball. And those that can't say that they've been down the bay, well, they haven't seen Cardiff at all.
Here we can see the last remaining facade of Butte Street, which we've been so painfully deprived of in the past, which leads us down to West Butte Street into Mount Stuart Square, which fortunately is still there for us to see. So that's where we're going to go now. So we can see Mount Stuart Square. So follow me now, let's go.
And those that can't say that they've been down the bay, well, they haven't seen Cardiff at all.
Now this is the Butte Dock Hotel and is an extension of what was the Baltimore on the other side. The cottage-like structure, which this pub is made out of, is typical of the many cottage-like buildings throughout Tiger Bay and the docks. And in fact, cottage-like structures stretched all the way up the rest of West Butte Street, beyond the National Westminster Bank, which we see here, an exact replica of the facade we saw on Butte Street. On the opposite side is the Cymric buildings, built in 1913 and which was once a post office exchange. But this is a fantastic building designed by Henry Budgeon, and if you don't look up, you won't see the various mythological beasts and sea creatures hiding in the nooks and crannies of this grand structure. They started to demolish Tiger Bay in the 60s and 70s, and they came down into Mount Stuart Square with the intention of demolishing St. Stephen's, which by that time had already been deconsecrated. And they came to inspect it and noticed the 5 stained glass windows on the north face. However, once they cleaned the grime off to see what was beneath the soot of a century of time, they discovered 2 of these stained glass windows were actually made in the William Morris Studios in Holland Park in London, and that gave this building a listed status, and that's the reason we still see it today. And of course now it is the Point, which is a theatre space and design centre. Now we should go into Mount Stuart Square to see the other interesting buildings that are there. So follow me this way into Mount Stuart Square. Now here in front of us is Cambrian Buildings, another Henry Budgeon masterpiece, but it's much older than Cymric Buildings around the corner, being built around 1911. Right next to it is the magnificent Beynon Building, with lots of ornate architectural features screaming out for explanation. If you look up, you'll see cherubs or babies, or perhaps they're images of the Marquis and one of his relatives in nappies or something. There's all sorts of interesting bas-relief, especially maritime bas-relief with galleons and boats and what have you on the first floor. And next to Beynon House are the typical Georgian homes you'd see throughout the whole of Mount Stuart Square before the demolition, where local families lived until the 1960s. So let's go on into Mount Stuart Square now and see the rest of the square. Now here we are at the actual entrance to the Cardiff Coal Exchange. This was a very important building. It replaced one of the Marquis's parks that was in the centre of this square, and it was built in the 1880s, long after the Marquis had moved into Cardiff Castle. It was important because this is where the price of coal was determined for the whole world. Businessmen would go up these steps, Victorian ones in particular, right through these doors onto a huge wooden floor which still exists there with large, beautifully ornate wooden balconies, and big decisions were made. You know, in fact, the first £1 million cheque ever signed in the world was signed right here in Mount Stuart Square. So we were really Britain's second city at the turn of the century, when you have the largest bank outside London around the corner. It has ornate features around the entrance, and you can see lots of dragons, which are the typical emblem of Wales. But these dragons are not Welsh dragons at all. All of these dragons are Russian dragons, Baltic dragons. We had an international connection, because not only were Baltic dragons here, but we have African lions representing our Egyptian or port-side connection with the world. And if we look up the rest of Mount Stuart Square area, we can see the Dowlais Arcade. Now, when I was growing up, the Dowlais Arcade had cobbled stones in it, and it was a lane leading into the Dowlais pub, which is still there, in fact, as you'll see when you look down the lane. And it was lanes like these, dotted throughout Tiger Bay and the docks, that the Breton onion sellers used to come and stay in. And there we would go to see them. And of course, from those lanes, they would load their bicycles with onions and go all over the city of Cardiff selling their onions. Let's go down and see Perch Buildings, which is named after William Perch, who was a colliery owner in the valleys. And obviously, if you were a colliery owner, you had a great deal of wealth, and it was easy to have buildings named after you. And this is a lovely ornate structure if you take the time to look at it. Now, this is Baltic House. This is another Henry Budgeon masterpiece. It was built in 1915 and replaced 3 Georgian houses and a chapel. And as you can see, it's got amazing maritime bas-relief on its structure as well. And this also is the headquarters of Cardiff Bay Development Corporation. So they have quite a grand building for their headquarters. Of course, on the opposite side, we see the magnificent southern facade of the Coal Exchange building. This is not the main entrance, but it looks like it should be. It's such a grand facade on the south side. This building was meant to be Wales's Parliament 20 years ago, but nevertheless, it is a grand structure that deserves to be preserved. Now, before we leave Mount Stuart Square, we can see Aberdare House standing like an oasis between the spaces where the buildings were demolished in the 60s and 70s. Aberdare House was built in 1920, or approximately at that time, and next to this open parking lot, we can see the site where once stood the Casablanca, a famous nightclub known around the world. But many years before, when it was built in 1858, it was one of the Welsh-speaking churches that was located in the Tiger Bay and Dockland area. One of 4, in fact. Now, we shall go out of Mount Stuart Square and make our way down to the seafront and come towards the end of our walk. Now we're passing the modern structures, and here we come to lanes with textured stone, typical of the many lanes we used to find in Tiger Bay and the docks in the old days. Houses face back to back, and so there were lots of interesting lanes and stables and other features that children loved to play in, and all that is gone. And as we walk down towards the seafront, we'll actually leave the modern behind and enter into the past and see the kinds of homes and houses people lived in Tiger Bay and the docks as we come to the next building. Now we come to the old stucco wall buildings, which were typical of all the homes throughout Tiger Bay and the docks, and lets me know I've gone right back into my childhood and the past. And you can't fail to notice the convenient windowsill where people could just prop themselves down and hold court in front of your house, and neighbours would just come onto their doorstep and join you, because this was the proverbial congregational community, and the streets were filled with people, the grannies on the doorstep. People would bring their household furniture outside, and we'd all stand around and talk. Of course, if we were young, the adults would send us away because we weren't supposed to be listening to these conversations, but then we'd get a chance to go and play in the parks, as we'll see as we go down to Butte Esplanade. Now once again we see another one of the parks that the Marquis of Butte built in our area, and this brings us to Butte Esplanade. Now there's only a few houses left here, but at one time they ran right across the seafront and they had wrought iron balconies and other interesting features. But as the Mount Stuart dry dock began to grow from 1 dock to 2 dock to 3 docks, these houses were removed and curtailed abruptly by this industrial wall. Of course, nowadays the wall only serves to separate Techniquest from the residential community. And so we'll look over here now to Windsor Terrace. And these lovely Dutch gabled buildings were typical of the kinds of buildings you might have seen on the south side of Loudon Square. And now we'll just go right down to the sea wall so we can see the inner harbour area and Windsor Esplanade. Now we've arrived at a spot where many people in Cardiff have never been. And here we are at Windsor Esplanade, right on the seafront. And down to the left here we can see the grand houses of Windsor Esplanade where sea captains and pilots once lived. Now, very soon, right in front of us will be a new huge lake once Cardiff Bay has finished building its barrage. And so people living on Windsor Esplanade will be able to come across the street, jump onto their yachts, sail over to Tesco, do their shopping, and then sail back home. And so things will be very different in the near future. Now we'll make our way to the inner harbour and the end of our journey. Now here we've arrived in the inner harbour at the end of our walk around Tiger Bay and the docks. Here we can see Techniquest and Harry Ramsden's, which represents the future of Cardiff Bay. I do hope you enjoyed your journey with me this afternoon. And all I'm left to say is diolch yn fawr iawn am ei cysturiaeth tosturiol. Oh, thank you very kindly for your kind attention. And finally, just thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed your time here today.
Tiger Bay, Tiger Bay.